We got Gabe, an atheist from Texas. I'm so sorry you live in Texas, but what up, Gabe?
Hey, John. Hi, Mr. Seth. I wanted to ask, how do you respond to a Christian fundamentalist pastor that says the story of offering the slave Onesimus is a statement from the Bible that slavery isn't good, as it's promoted by the Bible?
Okay, your call is very difficult to hear because there's an extremely high distortion level. Let me see if I understand what you're asking. You have a believer who is a Bible literalist who is saying that God is against slavery because Paul freed a slave in the New Testament. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I happen to narrate 2 books by an expert on the subject of biblical slavery, Dr. Joshua Bowen, who is an expert in the OT and a trained Assyriologist. And he has done, actually,
it's awesome.
He did the Old Testament book, and then did the Old Testament endorsed slavery, which is 1 book. And the short answer is he did. I mean, so what if Paul released a slave? You know, Christ was talking in Ephesians. He used slaves as a metaphor, didn't he? He was saying that, I'm doing this from memory, slaves, be obedient to your masters as they are to Christ. And, we never saw Christ repudiate or what's the word I'm looking for? He never condemned slavery.
Yeah.
And so this idea that there may have been an instance where a disciple let a slave go means nothing. We don't see the decrying or in the condemnation of slavery really anywhere throughout Scripture. In fact, what we see is a celebration of it, and that includes when you go back to the original, or what we believe are the original texts of that time, and the translations which come with those texts. They talk about chattel slavery, owning another human being as property, sometimes sex slavery, slaves that can be passed down from generation to generation, meaning that if that slave and a slave wife has a child, the child isn't free. The child then by default becomes the property of the master. That's not indentured servitude. It's not some voluntary deal where they signed on the line. No, this is actual ownership of human beings. And that's kind of where I go. But the book itself is probably the best resource for me on that. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Okay, Ephesians 6:5. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Seth said, that Dr. Joshua Bowen's book, Did the Bible Endorse Slavery, is really important for this discussion because it's going to cover like every single argument that could get thrown your direction. But luckily, both Seth and I are personal friends of Dr. Joshua Bowen, and Josh gave me, a digital copy of chapter 10, which directly covers the question that you have with, it's in the book of Philemon, the letter to Philemon or whatnot. And what Dr. Josh does is he actually quotes from Hector Avalos, who was a biblical expert, and Avalos says this, quote, "Nowhere in the letter do we see Paul saying slavery is a sin and you must free Onesimus." I don't know if that's how you pronounce the name, but
yeah, I don't know how to pronounce it either.
Yeah. Nowhere in the letter do we have anything even akin to the strong directive issued by Paul on such things as drunkenness or adultery, which occurs in 1 Corinthians 6:8-9, incest, which is 1 Corinthians 5. Or just not working hard enough, which is 2 Thessalonians 2:10. Josh, that's end quote. Josh continues in his book saying, at best, it would seem the book of Philemon is evidence of Paul encouraging Philemon to forgive and free his runaway slave in order that Onesimus might return to Paul to help him in the ministry. In no way is this a broad directive against owning other human beings as slaves. A lot of times, slavery slavery apologists for the Bible claim that these types of passages do not condone slavery, and therefore that means that God does not condone slavery, or that first century Jews or Jewish Christians wouldn't have condoned slavery. But that's literally not true, because they obviously did condone it. God condoned it in the Old Testament in several different ways. Seth said something about sexual slavery. You have to reconfigure your brain a little bit when you're thinking about the different types of slavery that exist, because chattel slavery, that's easily identifiable. Chattel slavery is just owning another person as property. We see that in several different verses in the Old Testament. But when we're talking about sexual slavery, you have to sort of reorient yourself, because any forced marriage is going to be a type of sexual slavery. And this is actually supported by experts in the field. I can't think right off the top of my head the exact author. There was an author that an expert in like Roman history and everything like that addressed sexual slavery specifically. But basically, if there's any kind of forced marriage or a marriage or any kind of situation where the ability of being able to determine your whether or not you have sex, that is considered a type of sexual slavery. So all throughout the Old Testament, do you have sexual slavery being implemented? And this seems to be something that God, as well as the Israelites, don't have a problem with. This seems to be normalized. So in a more natural aspect to it, this is perfectly understandable by the culture and the time frame in which they existed in. The culture obviously didn't identify any kind of idea of consent, at least as as us in the modern time contemporaneously understand consent. At the time, consent was just not a thing that was considered as far as the women at that time go. You had people that just basically sold women into marriages. And if there's no consent that is considered on the woman's part, then it is a forced marriage, which ends up being sexual slavery. And so what you have is all throughout the Old Testament, a type of sexual slavery is implemented and condoned and even mandated by God in several respects. That's not even getting to the part where God condones and mandates different types of slaves being taken in different ways in which people can be turned into chattel slaves. So just this one verse in Paul in Philemon, where he doesn't even advocate for the freeing of all slaves, does nothing to combat against how the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament definitely condone slavery. So even if you could find one instance, let's just assume that Paul definitely said you should free your slave because slavery is wrong. Even if you had that is not God. Like Paul in his letters never indicates that is something that Jesus told him. This is something that he is advocating for on his own personal terms. And he doesn't say that Jesus mandates this or Jesus commands this or God commands this or anything like that. So this is just a personal whim of a follower of Jesus and not anything that is actually directed by Jesus. So if I was approached by somebody that was giving me this line about Onesimus in Philemon, I would just lay out the mountains of evidence prior to this point, so that even if we give you this point, which we really shouldn't, but even if we give you this point, it does nothing to combat against everything that the Old Testament and the New Testament, for that matter, and history lays out. So I don't know. That's a really long answer to this very simple question, but that's how I would answer it.
Hello?
Oh, hey, yeah, we're here. Sorry. I didn't hear you. You said you appreciated it?
Yes.
Awesome.
And I have one more question. Is Ephesians 6:5? I told him, the one that says that slaves obey your masters. He says that's not from Jesus. Is that correct?
Well, it was written by Paul. I don't think it was Christ speaking. It was Paul speaking on behalf of Christ. I'm doing that from memory. But the point is that these are God's agents speaking on behalf of Jesus in a Bible which essentially is a rule book or a guidebook for Christians to live. So whether or not it came out, the Ten Commandments didn't come out of Jesus's mouth either, and yet they are considered sacrosanct.
Yeah, and so to be clear, this is in Ephesians 6, 5, and 6. And basically, what Paul is doing is comparing slaves, as far as having masters. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. So he's obviously not he's obviously saying that, as a Christian, you are a slave to Christ. And he's comparing that to the earthly slavery that is experienced. And he's, equating the two, saying that you should obey your earthly slaves just like you obey Christ. And so he's kind of bridging this connection there between believing in Christ and being a Christian and being a slave, in that you don't have any kind of ability to, revoke consent from being ordered to do anything or anything like that. Like, you don't have free will in this situation, just like as a Christian, you don't have free will as far as what Christ wants you to do. So while Christ isn't saying this necessarily, it's Paul drawing upon current situations in his time to compare that to what your relationship should be to Christ. So it's definitely not a condemnation of any kind of slavery or anything like that. And in fact, it would be more of an enlightening thing about the nature of a Christian's servitude or connection to Christ, and that's of a slave, in that you don't have the opinion or you don't have the ability to deny anything from Christ. You just have to do what Christ says. So that's how I would answer that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for calling, Gabe. Have a good one, brother.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. And I read your books, Seth. Read some of your books. I really found them very hilarious. Thank you for making them.
Thanks for calling. Sorry we couldn't get a better connection there. It's interesting to watch the tap dance that happens when people get into Old Testament, New Testament, right? Well, Christ came and he gave us the new covenant in Matthew. So now we can wipe out the Old Testament, all of the barbarism. And I was going through someone who was condemning me on my social media page today. The reason you have rejected Christianity is because you don't fully understand it and you just want to sin. And so I just went through and I'm like, well, is it unreasonable to say that there might be some problems with stories about cosmically conjured garden nudists and 900-year-old human beings and flying fire chariots and sea monsters and people who gained superpower based on the length of their hair and blood atonement, blood magic, magic healing mud, an unwed teenager who was impregnated via ghost sex, and, the seven-headed dragon of Revelation who came down to condemn the plan. I mean, is it really problematic for someone to raise an eyebrow and say, hey, wait a minute, that's a problem? And they discount the Old Testament by saying, well, God is love and it's all the new covenant. And of course, this ignores the fact that the New Testament has a lot of crazy shit in it as well. It also ignores the fact that Jesus affirmed himself that he came to essentially affirm the law, right? Everything will be fulfilled according to Yahweh. And the third thing is that Christ wasn't always a good guy. People like to talk about Jesus being love and light and happy, joy, kumbaya Jesus. But the truth is that he often said some very problematic things. He said some racist things. He was hateful. He was dismissive of people and their loved ones and their children whenever he wouldn't even allow them to go home and say goodbye. He wanted them to just join up and leave with him. He gave bad advice about loaning money. You know, he gave advice about a lot of things that are just bad. And this is the same Jesus who is God, part of the Trinity, who is one of the architects and authors of hell theology. Depart from me, you who are cursed, into a lake of everlasting fire. So Jesus doesn't get a pass. And certainly Jesus did not give slavery a pass in the New Testament.
Yeah, totally. And you would think that for a God that is like all knowing, or, even if you consider Jesus being that he is part of God, however you want to interpret that, I would think that, one of the first things, considering the history of the world that we know of, you would think that, saying a few choice phrases might have been great. Like, hey, maybe don't groom and sexually abuse young children in your congregation. Like, I feel like that, simply putting that in however terms that a first century Jew would have put it in, I feel like that would have really alleviated a whole lot of stuff, or at least made it a little bit easier for Christians to call out sex abuse in the church. And we just don't see that happening, especially with God and his 10 commandments that, like Louisiana is being forced to put in every single classroom. The first 4 commandments are, a self-serving, ego-stroking statements about God. And I feel like God could have made one ego-stroking statement, and then he had 3 different, positions in which to put like very important moral statements. But we don't see that happening. We see God only caring about, what benefits him and what he wants, regardless of what that means for future generations of people, his people.
We lost somebody off the switchboard, someone named Noah, and I've been asked if we can ask if Noah would call back. So please dial back the switchboard.
Yes, definitely. If anybody is in the chat and they think that they can prove that their God exists, or prove any particular part of the Christian narrative, or, if you disagree with Seth and I on anything that we've said so far, which we're about to get into some reliability and history of the Bible stuff, if you disagree with anything that we say, definitely call in and we can talk about it. We'd love to talk about things. We promise not to go ape shit on you.
Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Did you know we saw what you were doing when you watched it?
We saw all of it. All of it. All of it.
All of it. So you're going to want to pay us hush money over at patreon.com/calltheline, where you can buy our silence and watch our patron exclusive podcast.